On a bright September morning in 1923, as merchants unloaded silks and sailors clustered in the narrow streets of Yokohama, the ground itself began to convulse. Stone walls cracked like eggshells, and within minutes fire leapt from collapsed kitchens, racing across the wooden city faster than men could run. Amid the devastation, one small company of Freemasons picked their way through rubble to the smouldering ruins of their temple on Yamashita-cho. The columns were toppled, the square and compasses charred, the records reduced to ash. And yet, in the cinders of that moment, the brethren resolved that their labour would not end. They would meet in warehouses, burnt-out shells, even in the bare rooms of trading houses, wherever three could gather, until charity and determination could raise again a house fit for their mysteries. From those ashes rose not only a new temple, but a parable, that Masonry in Japan would be no stranger to ruin nor to rebirth. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's presentation From the Quarries, an archive of Masonic lore. When the first Masons unfurled their warrants in Japan, the country itself was in the throes of transformation. The Tokugawa shogunate had only recently yielded to the Meiji Restoration, and the new state was determined to learn from the West while preserving its own identity. Into this paradoxical atmosphere of ironclad tradition coexisting with telegraph wires and steamships came a fraternity whose symbols, rituals, and ideals must have seemed as exotic to Japanese eyes as the samurai's sword did to the newly arrived foreigner. In Yokohama, the treaty port carved from rice paddies in the 1850s, Masonic lodges rose amid the clapboard houses, merchant counting rooms, and consulates of the foreign settlement. Sailors in white caps, tea and silk traders, and engineers from Britain or Scotland could climb the bluff and gather by candlelight under the all-seeing eye, raising a tiled floor where only a decade earlier fishermen had mended their nets. Kobe followed in 1872 with its Rising Sun Lodge, an apt title for a port city at the forefront of Japan's sunrise into modernity. In Nagasaki, long accustomed to Dutch traders on Dashima, the Scottish Constitution granted warrant to Lodge No. 710, weaving Masonic ritual into a harbour that had already been Japan's narrow window to the west. To Japanese onlookers, these gatherings must have been baffling. Here were men of rank and nationality otherwise divided, English, Scottish, American, German, now robed in aprons and exchanging cryptic handshakes in shuttered halls. Yet those halls themselves soon became landmarks of cosmopolitan Japan. In Kobe, a Masonic hall was founded in 1871, its foundation stone laid with pomp, and by 1909 the impressive Corinthian Hall was erected as the seat of the District Grand Lodge. In an era when Western clubs and associations sprang up across the treaty ports, Freemasonry stood apart, not simply as another expatriate social club, but as a society cloaked in ritual, speaking of brotherhood and enlightenment in ways unfamiliar to Japanese civic culture. Thus, the first half-century of Masonry in Japan was both fragile and distinctive, a fraternity of foreigners, existing by the grace of treaty port extraterritoriality, flourishing in the liminal spaces where Japanese modernization and Western traditions uneasily converged. If the first lodges thrived under the protection of treaty port extraterritoriality, they did so in a country that looked upon secret meetings with deep suspicion. The Meiji state, intent on forging a modern nation, was acutely wary of anything that might rival its authority. In 1887, an imperial rescript prohibited assemblies of a secret nature. Though not aimed specifically at the craft, the decree cast a long shadow. For a fraternity that valued its privacy and symbolism, it meant that any engagement with Japanese citizens could be construed as illicit. Diplomatic channels were quietly engaged. In 1894, the US Secretary of State sought clarification, and Tokyo responded with a delicate compromise. Masonic meetings would not be interfered with, provided no Japanese nationals were admitted. This gentleman's agreement was never enshrined in statute, yet it governed practice for the next half-century. Lodges continued to thrive in Kobe, Yokohama, and Tokyo, but their membership lists read like shipping registers rather than local rolls. British merchants, Scottish engineers, American naval officers, and the occasional German consul. To Japanese onlookers, Masonry was a curiosity, neither condemned outright nor embraced, but tolerated as a peculiarity of the foreign settlements. Newspaper articles occasionally mentioned strange midnight gatherings of Europeans who marched in aprons and collars, but for the Japanese elite, the craft remained opaque. Even those few Japanese aristocrats who desired initiation had to seek it abroad. Men like Count Takeichi Hayashi, initiated in London in 1886, or Nabeshima Yotaro in 1903. At home, the tiled doors of the lodge were closed to them. This prohibition was not merely legal, but cultural. In a society where loyalty to emperor and family defined social order, the idea of swearing oaths to a universal brotherhood, using cryptic symbols and foreign ritual, was bound to provoke unease. Thus, Masonry in Japan entered the 20th century as an enclave institution. Visible in its temples, known in diplomatic circles, yet curiously disconnected from the very society that surrounded it. When Tokyo American Lodge first opened under dispensation in October 1947, material was scarce. Aprons were fashioned from condemned Japanese silk parachutes salvaged from military stores. They were serviceable, save for one oversight. Someone had forgotten to attach strings. That evening, more than 150 brethren filed into the Joshi Kaiken Hall, holding their aprons awkwardly in place with elbows and forearms, while aluminium jewels, cut from scrap, caught the light. The Tyler's register shows 102 names signed, a record not of splendour, but of stubborn fidelity. The craft could improvise, so long as it could meet. At precisely 11:58 on the 1st of September 1923, the Kanto plain heaved with a force that split roads, snapped rail lines, and toppled houses in their thousands. In Yokohama, the elegant temple of Star in the East Lodge at 61 Yamashita-cho crumbled in moments, its walls collapsing before the brethren had time to salvage even their working tools. Fires, driven by sudden gales, consumed what the quake had spared. Within hours, Yokohama was a sea of flame. In the smouldering ruins, the square encompasses lay blackened and twisted, yet the fraternity did not perish with the stone. Brethren gathered first in the shell of a trading company near Hanazonobashi, later in a warehouse on the docks, conducting meetings with what furniture and jewels they could improvise. The ritual continued under charred beams, and the tiler's register still bore new signatures, even if the ink was blotted by ash. For the members, these improvised assemblies were not only acts of duty, but quiet defiance against despair. Relief followed swiftly from beyond Japan's shores. The General Masonic Charity Fund of Japan distributed assistance to brethren and their families, while the United Grand Lodge of England sent 80,000 yen, a vast sum in those years, to rebuild. On 12th February 1927, the new Bluff Temple at No. 3 Yamate-cho was dedicated. Bronze plaques fixed at its entrance proclaimed the gratitude of Japanese lodges to their English benefactors, and the building itself became a symbol of endurance. The earthquake thus became part of Masonic law in Japan, a disaster that obliterated walls but not fraternity, and a lesson in how charity, transformed into literal stone, could bind local brethren to their global kin. By the late 1930s, the optimism of the Treaty Port era had faded. Japan was mobilizing for war in China, and suspicion of secret societies grew ever more acute. Freemasonry, with its foreign lodges, closed doors, and cryptic symbolism, was an easy target for an anxious state that equated secrecy with sedition. On the 8th of December 1941, the day Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, police in Yokohama and other cities moved swiftly. The Temple of Star in the east was seized outright. Officials catalogued and confiscated everything within its walls: all lodge furniture, regalia, jewels, tools, implements, and books. Brethren were arrested, interrogated, in some cases jailed. What had been a sanctuary of fraternity was suddenly redefined as a storehouse of subversion. Yet the story is more than bureaucratic confiscation. It is also one of quiet courage. Brethren risked much to conceal fragments of lodge history. Records were hidden by devious and dangerous means in private homes or smuggled into safe hands, so that successors might know their lineage when peace returned. Such acts of preservation, though unglamorous, were as vital as any battle honour, for they carried forward the thread of memory when the craft itself seemed extinguished. The intellectual climate was equally hostile. Anti-Masonic pamphlets and conspiracy tracts, some imported from Europe, were circulated to justify the suppression. But amid the clamour, one extraordinary exception emerged: Rosanne Osawa's 520-page Freemasonry that exists in Japan, 1941. Instead of vilification, Osawa attempted a balanced survey, quoting Anderson's Constitutions, Pike's Morals and Dogma, and even the bylaws of Yokohama Lodge No. 1092 and Star in the East No. 640. In an era when objective study could itself be seen as disloyal, Osawa's work was an act of intellectual integrity, quietly heroic in its own way. When the war ended, the confiscated treasures resurfaced in the most unlikely places. 4 crates of lodge records were discovered in the disused Yokohama Yacht Club. The lodge's clock was found ticking in the office of the city's chief of police. Most astonishing of all, the lodge organ, once used to swell the notes of solemn ritual, was uncovered in the private home of the police sergeant who had overseen Masonic prosecutions. One imagines the strange dissonance of its tones, once reserved for sacred labour, echoing in the sergeant's parlour as his family gathered round. Thus the wartime years stand in Japanese Masonic history as both nadir and paradox. A time when the craft was denounced as dangerous, its symbols stripped from their temples, and yet, Through the resilience of individual brethren and the sheer oddities of circumstance, its material culture and its spirit endured. In the confusion of wartime confiscations, Masonic regalia and furnishings disappeared into police custody. Years later, after the occupation began, brethren set about retrieving what they could. In Yokohama, 4 crates of records were located in the abandoned yacht club. The lodge clock was found in the chief of police's office, still ticking. But the strangest discovery was the lodge organ. Once used to swell solemn hymns within tiled walls, it now sat incongruously in the parlour of the police sergeant who had overseen anti-Masonic prosecutions. The image is almost surreal. Children perhaps listening to its tones, unaware they echoed from a past their father had tried to erase. Its recovery became less a matter of property than a parable. Symbols may be confiscated, but memory has a way of playing itself back. When the guns fell silent in 1945, Masonry in Japan stirred cautiously back to life. Its first rebirth was not in solemn temples, but in makeshift clubs. The Tokyo Bay Masonic Club, formed by soldiers and civilians who had survived the war or newly arrived with the occupation. They gathered in borrowed halls, comparing scraps of memory and piecing together what was left of their craft. At first, it was less a lodge than a clearinghouse for fellowship and lost property. Reports circulated of regalia hidden in warehouses, documents resurfacing in yacht clubs, even jewels turning up in private hands. In Kobe, symbolism took on an almost cinematic irony. General Robert Eichelberger, commanding the 8th Army, granted brethren the use of the German Club Concordia, a building long associated with Nazi gatherings. "You will have the Nazi room in Kobe for your lodge meetings," his staff announced. Thus, a hall once draped in swastikas was rededicated to the square and compasses, a gesture that needed no explanation. But the most enduring vignette belongs to Tokyo in October 1947. At the Joshi Kaikan, more than 150 brethren assembled under the authority of a dispensation from Connecticut. With supplies scarce, aprons had been sewn from condemned Japanese parachutes. In the rush of preparation, someone forgot to attach strings, leaving brethren to clutch them awkwardly in place, while jewels of scrap aluminium glinted in the lamplight. The Tyler's Register bore 102 signatures that night, proof that the essence of Masonry, its form, spirit, and fellowship, did not depend on wealth of material. These early occupation stories mark the moment when Masonry in Japan transitioned from exile back into daylight. Improvised, imperfect, even faintly absurd at times, they reveal a truth as old as the craft, that the lodge exists not in its walls or trappings, but in the persistence of its members to meet on the level, wherever they may find themselves. For nearly 6 decades, the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1894 had defined Masonry in Japan as a foreign fraternity. Its temples stood within Japanese cities, yet their doors were closed to Japanese citizens. Even the few who joined had to do so abroad. Count, later Viscount, Takechi Hayashi was initiated in London in 1886, Nabeshima Yotaro in an Anglo-colonial lodge in 1903, and a handful of others followed suit. At home, however, the tiled threshold remained forbidden ground. That barrier fell in the immediate aftermath of war. The occupation had stripped away much of Japan's pre-war authoritarianism, and with it the suspicion that had kept Masonic rituals quarantined as secret societies. Inquiries to Tokyo revealed that no legal statute explicitly forbade membership. The old prohibition, it turned out, was remembered more by foreign diplomats than by Japanese officials. Into this uncertain opening stepped Naotake Sato, then president of the House of Councillors and a respected diplomat. In a carefully worded petition to General Douglas MacArthur, he and others requested permission and blessings that we may join the Masonic Order. The letter emphasized that the moral instruction given by Major Michael Rivistow of the occupation forces had won over our hearts. It was, in tone, both dignified and deferential, an appeal framed within Japan's new democratic ethos, yet still couched in the etiquette of supplication to authority. The response was favorable. For the first time, Japanese candidates were initiated not abroad, but in their own country. The symbolism was immense. What had long been a fraternity of expatriates, confined to the treaty ports and their foreign settlements, now became something in which Japanese men of rank and responsibility could freely participate. This moment marked the true indigenization of the craft in Japan, a pivot from foreign enclave to national fraternity. In the ruins of post-war Kobe, brethren sought a place to meet. The answer came, ironically, from the 8th Army Commander, General Robert Eichelberger. He authorized them to use the German club Concordia, once a gathering place for local Nazis. "You will have the Nazi room in Kobe for your lodge meetings," his staff declared. The irony was delicious. A hall once filled with banners of hate was rededicated to a fraternity devoted to brotherhood. Every meeting there carried a quiet sense of poetic justice, as if the square and compasses themselves had conquered by occupation what arms had defeated in war. The immediate post-war years were a time of improvisation. Parachute aprons, regalia of scrap aluminium, lodges meeting in borrowed halls. But within 2 years, order began to return, and the question arose, under whose jurisdiction would Masonry in Japan be properly constituted? The earliest post-war dispensation, Tokyo American Lodge, under Connecticut, proved short-lived. Renewed in 1948, but never granted a charter, it lapsed in 1949. Yet its existence pointed to a deeper need. The scattered clubs of American servicemen and expatriates could not thrive indefinitely without the structure of a Grand Lodge. That framework came from the Philippines. The Grand Lodge in Manila, itself forged out of American and Filipino cooperation earlier in the century, was uniquely positioned to guide Japan's revival. Beginning in 1947, it issued charters for a series of new lodges. Yokosuka Naval Lodge No. 120, Far East No. 124 in Yokohama, Tokyo No. 125, Square and Compass, No. 126 in Tachikawa, and Kyushu No. 127 in Kokura. Each lodge bore the hallmarks of its founding constituency: naval personnel, occupation officials, expatriate civilians. But together they began to stitch a network across the Japanese archipelago. As the 1950s unfolded, these lodges matured. Japanese candidates were now being initiated alongside Americans and Britons. The ritual itself translated into Japanese for the first time. In 1954, Manila established a District Grand Lodge of Japan, a clear sign that the craft here had moved beyond emergency measures and was preparing for autonomy. The decisive moment came in early 1957. 15 lodges convened in convention, voted for independence, elected officers, and dispatched a delegation to Manila's annual communication. There, recognition was granted. The Grand Lodge of Japan was consecrated that same year, a sovereign body at last. In less than a decade, Masonry in Japan had travelled from a warehouse lit by scavenged lamps to a full Grand Lodge, its warrants issued in Japanese cities rather than foreign chancelleries. For men who had clutched parachute aprons to their waists in 1947, the founding of a Grand Lodge in 1957 must have felt like the culmination of a pilgrimage. Proof that the craft, once merely tolerated in treaty ports, had taken root in Japanese soil. Institutions may define Masonry, but its vitality is measured in the lives of individual brethren. The post-war years in Japan produced moments at once poignant and extraordinary, which deserve to be remembered as much as constitutions or warrants. In 1946, Star in the East Lodge conferred honorary membership upon General Douglas MacArthur and General Robert Eichelberger by acclamation, an act that testified to gratitude as much as ceremony. A few months later, Australian Commander General Horace Robertson was similarly honoured. The gesture was symbolic. Men who had overseen war and occupation now acknowledged in the roles of fraternity, a bridge between conquerors and the conquered laid upon the square. The minute book from April 1946, recording the first regular meeting after 4 years and 5 months, conveys its emotion in restrained prose. Brethren noted that their trials and sufferings, while in jail, had been almost beyond human endurance. That phrase, spare, unadorned, testifies more eloquently than rhetoric to the ordeal of war. Yet in the same meeting, candidates were initiated, proving that even grief could be folded into continuity. Other entries capture the quiet urgency of renewal. Emergency meetings called to initiate any 7 applicants, 1 minute records. Such words suggest not disorder, but appetite. Men hungry for the fellowship and stability Masonry offered in a time of upheaval. Beyond generals and dignitaries, it was the persistence of ordinary brethren that ensured survival. Men who risked concealing lodge records, who scrounged for tools and jewels, who borrowed halls and stitched aprons, performed acts of memory as significant as any ritual. They remind us that the craft is never solely defined by buildings or numbers, but by the tenacity of individuals to preserve its light through the darkest seasons. The appetite for fraternity after the war was so intense that minutes of Star in the East Lodge record an unusual phrase. Emergency meetings to initiate any 7 applicants. The number 7 may have been the administrative shorthand, but the image it conjures is powerful. Imagine, in a city still charred by earthquake and war, men pressing forward to join an order they had once been forbidden even to approach. To the brethren, each new initiation was more than ceremony. It was the steady proof that Masonry in Japan was not merely being rebuilt, it was being reborn, candidate by candidate, obligation by obligation. With the consecration of the Grand Lodge of Japan in 1957, the craft stepped out of its long provisional phase and into sovereignty. For the first time, warrants bore the names of Japanese cities rather than foreign chancelleries, and ritual, already translated into Japanese, was being worked by native brethren alongside expatriates. Growth came quickly. By the early 1970s, membership had reached its peak. Nearly 4,800 men spread across roughly 20 lodges. The numbers, though modest by global standards, were remarkable given the context. A fraternity once confined to treaty port enclaves had, within a generation, become a national body with its own officers, traditions, and rhythm of labour. Yet the character of membership remained mixed. American servicemen stationed in Japan during the Cold War years formed a substantial portion of lodge rolls, joined by businessmen and engineers from abroad. Increasingly, however, Japanese professionals, parliamentarians, jurists, physicians, and scholars took their places in the East and West. Their presence shifted the tenor of Masonry from an expatriate association into something recognizably integrated with Japanese civic life. The broader setting also mattered. These were the years of Japan's economic miracle, when factories multiplied, neon towers rose, and the country reimagined itself as a modern democracy. In such an atmosphere, voluntary associations flourished, professional societies, alumni networks, and service clubs like Rotary. Masonry, once tolerated as a foreign curiosity, now fit more naturally within this expanding civil society. To join the craft in the 1960s was no longer to risk suspicion, but to claim a place within a cosmopolitan fraternity that promised both moral instruction and social fellowship. By the late 1970s, the initial surge slowed, mirroring trends across the Masonic world. Yet the achievement remained profound. Within 20 years, the fraternity had gone from parachute aprons and improvised jewels to a Grand Lodge recognized internationally, peopled by both foreign and Japanese brethren, and solidly anchored in the civic landscape of modern Japan. From the treaty port lodges to the Grand Lodge of Japan, Freemasonry on the archipelago has journeyed through calamity, suppression, and rebirth to become a venerable institution, now firmly planted in modern soil. Today, the craft meets in the Tokyo Masonic Center, a modest-seeming two-story building that belies its historical pedigree. It stands on land once belonging to the Hisamatsu family, ancient retainers of Tokugawa Ieyasu, and was shaped from the former Naval Officers Club into a foundation-owned Masonic home through the charitable cooperation of Scottish Rite bodies and the Tokyo Masonic Association. Each spring, the Grand Lodge gathers not only Masons but children and families at its annual Children's Festival, a gesture of fraternity that resonates far beyond the ritual lodge room. In March 2025, over 300 brethren and guests from more than 20 countries gathered beneath spring blossoms at ANCOM, symbolizing the Grand Lodge's vibrant international presence. Meanwhile, the Tokyo Masonic Center is undergoing reconstruction, a timely reminder that renewal is built into Masonic architecture as it is into its story. Yet beneath the stones and programming lies a fraternity that continues its centuries-old task, stitching universal ideals, brotherly love, relief, and truth into a living local tradition. The Grand Lodge of Japan now stands in amity with over 150 other jurisdictions worldwide, and Masonry here is no longer a foreign curiosity, but a civic legacy tempered by history and shaped by Japanese hands. As you reflect on this journey through quakes, war, exclusion, and resurrection, ask yourselves, what does it mean when an institution founded by outsiders becomes part of the national fabric? How do rituals transplanted from elsewhere take root in a different cultural soil? And what lessons ought we draw when values endure, even as temple doors tumble, records vanish, or buildings lie in ruins? In Japan, the craft has answered these questions not by retreating into the past, but by building forward, just as Masons have always done, square by square. For a deep dive into the history, philosophy, and traditions of Freemasonry, subscribe to From the Quarries. You will find hundreds of lectures, presentations, shorts, and other Masonic works written by Freemasons for Freemasons. Visit fromthequarries.com or YouTube at From the Quarries.